Antonio Conte is obviously the name on everyone's lips at the moment. When we got him through the door, everyone was so excited. Another elite manager through the door. It's turned sour once again, as it usually does with Antonio Conte. But if you cast your mind back to maybe the back end of last season, it seemed like all the players were on board. We were playing good football. We were scoring a lot of goals, catapulted ourselves into that Champions League football. But what's happened since then, and why does it seem like the players are not on board with him anymore? What's changed from maybe the back end of last season till now?
Yeah, it is really interesting because when I look back on that May 2022 period, and especially you'll remember obviously the 3-0 win over Arsenal, which it didn't guarantee top four, but it was pretty crucial in doing so, and coupled with Arsenal then losing to Newcastle, Spurs got fourth. And at that time, that felt so critical, and the noises were that Spurs would be able to kick on, while Arsenal would be consigned to the wilderness for forevermore. Obviously, they've gone in really different directions since. I've been asking myself that question a lot. Why have Spurs not kicked on? I guess and I did a big piece on this with Jack Pitbrook last week, kind of looking at what was going on behind the scenes, etc. But to go chronologically, I mean, the summer was always going to be important, and what's weird is that at the time it felt like quite a positive summer. Spurs spent quite a lot of money, 60 million on Richarlison, come in as a backup, felt like a pretty big boy move. Basuma came in. He's a player I've always thought is fantastic, and I thought would be a really good player for Spurs. I remember he was amazing for Brighton against them in a game Brighton won in April of last year. And obviously then there was the Jed Spence thing, and Conte telling us in Korea that it was a club signing. And I think that was when you saw maybe the fault lines starting to show a little bit. But I've been really surprised. The performance levels have just been so underwhelming. And I think, part of that is the slight inflexibility tactics-wise on Conte's part. The fact that he would pretty much always play the same team. There wasn't a huge amount of rotation. And I think players just started to get a little bit tired of it. The fact that it was always the same thing, there wasn't much variety, and suddenly all the kind of work they were doing on the training pitch, which had gone down really well in Conte's first season, becomes a little bit tedious when it's the same thing without a huge amount of variety. And and then there are lots of factors. The Spurs have been unlucky with injuries. Obviously, Conte's had a lot of things to deal with in his personal life. There was the World Cup. I think it's just all combined to make this sort of quite meh season where they just have, I don't know, it's never caught fire. Even the Champions League run felt really underwhelming somehow. I remember thinking, I think it was the Sporting Lisbon game at home, and just looking around and being like, top four Champions League was meant to be this panacea. It was meant to be, once you're in the top four, everything's great. And I was looking around, I was like, is anyone actually really enjoying themselves here? It felt pretty miserable. It's kind of been a theme of the season. Ditto that Milan second leg, Champions League knockout football. That's what this amazing stadium was built for. And it was all just really underwhelming. And then obviously the more things sort of started to go against Conte, the more he lashed out, and this sort of vicious cycle developed. And obviously that culminated in that pretty extraordinary press conference that we saw at St Mary's a few weeks ago. And by that point, his position was untenable, and they just had to work out all the terms of his exit. But yeah, it still remains. Speaking to people about it, a word I've heard a lot is waste. It just feels like a bit of a waste because. Yeah. It did feel at the end of last season like maybe something had changed and that Spurs could kick on and would kick on, and they've actually regressed. And I think that'll be a big source of regret for everyone at the club.
Yeah, and talking about, I read the article you and Jack wrote about the downfall of the Conte tenure, and obviously, as my brother mentioned, the players started to complain about the repetitiveness of the training and the lack of variation. But is that maybe a problem, what Conte is pointing out when it comes to talking about the culture of the club and maybe the culture of the mentality of the players? When he talks, because we've heard these kind of complaints from these players. This isn't the first time we've heard maybe these kind of of leaks to publications about complaints about training methods. We heard it at the back end of Pochettino's era. We've heard it in Jose Mourinho's era as well. Now we're hearing under Conte about these complaints. So when we start to hear these complaints, do you think it's more on the manager to kind of, obviously it's a manager's job to motivate, but is it on the manager to kind of prove to the players that his training methods are worth putting everything behind, or is it on the players to kind of have that self-motivation to make sure that they're fully behind the training methods?
Yeah, I mean, this is an argument that Conte was sort of making himself, that the players are seemingly bulletproof and don't get criticised, etc., and actually they need to have a look at themselves. I think there is some truth to that, and I think the players do have to take some responsibility for the fact that, you've seen, 4 managers get sacked in less than 4 years. That is an extraordinarily high number. I personally think that with the right head coach, you wouldn't be hearing these complaints. And that's not to say that Conte isn't a very talented, very good coach, because he is. He's done amazing things, and I'll hold my hands up. I've been very impressed with Conte at various points. And at the end of last season, I thought he'd done an amazing job, and I still think that. But I do think you need to find a way of motivating the players for a longer period of time, and I just don't think he was able to do that. It's not easy, but you look at guys like Klopp and Guardiola, and they are able to sort of regenerate and find ways of keeping the players invested. Even, look at Arteta, what he's doing over at Arsenal. So I think, yes, there are lessons for the players, and I think they do, in some respects, have to take more responsibility. But I think ultimately, if you find the right manager, and yes, at the end of Pochettino, things did go stale. He had been there 5.5 years, though, which in modern day football terms is an eternity. The only way you can really make that work is if you're constantly refreshing the squad, which has kind of been the City and to an extent the Liverpool model. Obviously, Spurs didn't really do that. So I don't think these are they're players that are beyond coaching, which is sort of what Conte was hinting at. I just think it's about making the right appointment, managerial appointment, which clearly is easier said than done.
Do you think it was a case of literally the whole squad turning on Conte? Because we've seen before when these kind of rumours come out, Harry Kane is usually the first one to say goodbye and thank you to the manager, as he did for Nuno, as he did for Jose Mourinho. But the silence for me is deafening at the moment, with no Spurs player whatsoever coming out on social media thanking Conte. Not even one like on his post saying goodbye to the Tottenham fans. I mean, for you, is that telling? And do you think the whole squad did turn their back on Conte?
Well, what's interesting with that is, if you remember when Conte came back for the Milan second leg, which wasn't that long ago, feels like a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
But at that point, I was told that, quite a lot of the players were still supportive of Conte. They were pleased to have him back. The vibes were actually quite good when he came back. Yes, there were people at that time also saying that it had been a lot better when he wasn't there, and it was a bit more relaxed, a bit less, friction with him not there and Stellini in. But there were still players who backed him when he came back. I think that all changed. That rant, the post-Southampton thing, that just burnt all his bridges. You even saw someone like Højbjerg, who was always very loyal to Conte, and generally as someone who's pretty respectful of his managers. When he was asked about it on international duty, it was pretty clear that he was pretty annoyed about it. He talked about the need for Conte to expand on what he'd said. So, I think had Southampton not happened, let's say they drew that game 0-0, Conte gave a really bland press conference, and then they decided this international break to get rid of Conte, I think there would have been a lot of tributes from the players. Yes, some would have had issues with him, but I think they would have respected what he did and would have, even if some of it was just lip service and platitudes, but I still think you would have had a bunch of the players doing that. I think when he did what he did and basically torched his relationship with the players, I think for a lot of them, it was like, I'm not going to pay tribute to what you did if you're going to hang us out to dry like that in the media, and in what felt, And I think, the players aren't stupid. If they felt what he was doing was to motivate them or whatever, like he sort of did against Burnley last season, but this felt far more self-serving than that. It felt, Conte basically saying to future employers, don't blame me for what's gone wrong here. This is down to the players.